Tonight, we embark on a gentle exploration of history's more peculiar exits, those strange, often humorous, and sometimes poetic moments when royalty met their unexpected ends. Imagine yourself drifting through hushed palace corridors, where velvet drapes mute the sounds of footsteps and the scent of old incense still lingers in the air. This isn't a journey of war or conquest, nor of declarations or dynasties, but something quieter and stranger. These are stories of kings and queens who left the stage not in glorious fanfare, but through the odd whims of fate, food, furniture, and folly. As you walk alongside these tales, don't worry, the path isn't frightening. It's paved with soft irony, light touches of humor, and a little absurdity, the kind that tickles the corners of your mind just enough to loosen the hold of wakefulness. These monarchs, emperors, and nobles didn't always fall with a sword in their chest or a rebellion at their door. No, sometimes history closes the curtain on a ruler with a clumsy misstep, an ill-advised indulgence, or a single moment of very human error. And as these tales unfold, you might find a certain comfort in knowing that even the most powerful were just as susceptible to the strange choreography of life's quieter tragedies. Before we settle into the stories, let yourself relax. Perhaps the hum of a fan in the background, the dim glow of a lamp, soft companions to the sounds of history. Together, we'll meander through the footnotes of time, wrapped in curiosity and the warmth of a blanket. Our first stop takes us to 12th century England, to the reign of King Henry I, a monarch who lived large and died on a full stomach. Henry had a noted fondness for lampreys, those ancient, eel-like creatures that slithered onto his royal table in the form of a medieval delicacy. Pale, jawless, and unlikely to appeal to modern palates, they were nevertheless the seafood of kings. But Henry's appetite often outpaced his physician's warnings. Despite their concern, he feasted on them with enthusiasm until, one day, he went too far. The tale goes that a surfeit of lampreys, that is, an overindulgence, brought about his untimely end. Whether it was truly the fish or some other hidden ailment, we'll never quite know. But history remembers it as death by dinner, a royal downfall delivered on a plate. Even today, historians debate the facts. Was it truly food poisoning, a heart condition, or simply the colorful way medieval chroniclers explained the sudden death of a king? Whatever the cause, it speaks to a truth as old as time. Our greatest weaknesses often lie not on the battlefield, but at the dinner table. As you picture this royal banquet, think of the heavy tapestries, the flickering candlelight, the hush after laughter when a king leans back in satisfaction, unaware that the very dish he so adored may soon write his final sentence. It's a tale not just of gluttony, but of stubbornness, a monarch's refusal to heed advice, and a moment where indulgence quietly overtook reason. From Henry's full belly, we sail eastward to the banks of the Chao Phraya River in Siam, now Thailand, where Queen Sananda Kumarurutana met a fate even more haunting in its calm absurdity. It was 1880, and the royal barge glided across the water like a golden mirage. The queen and her daughter, encircled by attendants, were enjoying what should have been a peaceful, unremarkable journey. But when the boat capsized, plunging its passengers into the river, no one came to their aid. Not because they couldn't, but because they wouldn't. Law dictated that touching a royal person, no matter the circumstance, meant death. And so, the queen drowned within sight of her own guards as they watched helplessly, bound by a decree that prized hierarchy over humanity. It's a tragedy steeped in solemn irony, where devotion and fear became indistinguishable, and where the weight of tradition bore down harder than the river's current. You can almost see the stunned faces, the muffled cries, the silence that followed, and the whispers that would ripple out across the palace halls in the days to come. But even in this sorrow, there is a quiet legacy. The queen's death prompted change. The law was re-examined, softened. The rigidity that cost a life slowly gave way to reason, and the river of progress, so often slow, finally shifted its course. Let your mind drift with that current now, floating gently from the heat of Siam to the damp chill of Tudor England, where Prince Arthur, eldest son of Henry VII and first husband of the future Queen Catherine of Aragon, lived a short, expectant life under the heavy weight of royal destiny. Groomed from childhood to inherit a kingdom, Arthur wore the crown's expectations like a second skin. Even his clothing was an echo of his role, lavish, ornate, stiff with embroidery and gems. But sometimes, what we wear to show our power becomes the very thing that wears us down. Arthur died young not long after his wedding. Was it from disease, overexposure during royal ceremonies, or perhaps, as some whisper, even the sheer burden of the occasion, his heavy finery, the drafty chambers, the unrelenting pressure to perform? Whatever the truth, it's easy to imagine the young prince shivering slightly beneath the weight of brocade, walking through shadowed halls already too large for him, carrying dreams he would never see fulfilled. His death opened the door to his younger brother, Henry VII, a man whose own indulgences and wives would alter history forever. And so Arthur remains a footnote of what if, a nearly king who might have led England down a gentler path. His story is less about grandeur and more about fragility, a reminder that sometimes the greatest shifts in history come not with a battle cry, but with the quiet extinguishing of a single, flickering light. We move next into the warm elegance of France in the late 15th century, where King Charles VII met a fate both tragic and mildly ridiculous. Charles, regal and determined, was making his way through ambush for a game of tennis. Yes, tennis. But in his haste, he failed to duck beneath a low doorway. The blow to his head proved fatal. The irony hangs in the air, doesn't it? A king, taken not by intrigue or battle, but by architecture. The detail is so mundane it feels like a comedy sketch. Yet there it is, preserved forever in the careful ink of history. 1 second, a ruler full of plans. The next, undone by a doorframe. Some say he lingered briefly, others that it was instant. The accounts differ, but the absurdity remains constant. And with it, a curious footnote. After Charles's death, some French architects began favoring higher arches in royal buildings, a small, permanent concession to avoid repeating the same mistake. So even in this final misstep, Charles left behind a legacy of sorts, one measured not in wars or treaties, but in centimeters of additional clearance. Think about that as you settle further into rest. Even kings are brought low by the everyday. Even palaces have sharp corners. From the shadows of French hallways, we move to the sun-soaked gardens of early 20th century Greece, where King Alexander met a foe far less regal than an invading army, yet no less deadly. Picture a peaceful day, the scent of citrus trees heavy in the air, the murmur of birdsong scattered among marble paths. Alexander, still young and navigating a kingdom reshaped by war, strolled the palace grounds accompanied by his dog. But fate had already placed its peculiar plan into motion. A scuffle broke out between his beloved pet and a resident monkey, perhaps one of the estate's exotic mascots, and in the heat of intervening, the king was bitten. Twice. It seemed trivial at first. An annoying bite, a scratch, nothing fit for the concern of kings, but infection bloomed beneath the skin, unnoticed until it was far too late. Sepsis followed, dragging the monarch down with quiet, methodical cruelty. The king who'd weathered politics and instability fell not to diplomacy nor sword, but to a pet monkey and an unlucky infection. Historians look back at this tale with furrowed brows and weary shrugs, still debating how such a strange encounter unraveled a nation's path. One moment of chaos, a ripple through the fabric of fate, and the trajectory of Greece bent in new directions. So you see, sometimes history's most absurd chapters bear the heaviest influence. All it takes is a monkey and a moment. We drift now into a tale older and darker, deep within the stone walls of medieval England. King Edward II, long embroiled in feuds, favoritism, and political disaster, found his downfall not on a battlefield, but in the cold, echoing halls of Berkeley Castle. After his deposition, whispers filled the air like smoke. Edward's enemies had not only stripped him of his crown but sought to erase him completely. Rumors swirled of his death in captivity, and with them came a story too grotesque, too symbolic, too strange to be easily forgotten. The red-hot poker. It was said, whispered in monasteries and behind cupped hands, that the deposed king met his end by this cruel tool, used not for punishment in the ordinary sense, but as a twisted warning, a final humiliation. Whether the tale was true or a grim invention by those eager to paint the king in infamy, remains a mystery. Historians question its veracity. It may have been a metaphor, an exaggerated cautionary tale spun by those who shaped England's narrative. And yet it endures, tucked into the folds of legend, a flickering ember of rumor that still glows in the darker corners of royal memory. Whether Edward perished by fire or by fable, he remains an eerie example of how the line between history and storytelling blurs when power is at stake. Now, let your mind wander to 18th century England, where another royal life ended in quiet, ironic tragedy. Prince Frederick, eldest son of King George II, was a man known more for his amusements than his rule, because he never lived to reign. His days were filled with pageantry and leisure, from cricket matches on rolling lawns to decadent afternoon feasts. And it was after one such day, whether from a blow during a game or, more curiously, from overindulging in ripe, juicy peaches, that Frederick's health took a sudden turn. The prince, already fragile, fell ill after a banquet where the sweetness of summer fruit reportedly became a bitter end. Was it truly the peaches that claimed him? Or was it a more complicated illness, veiled by the convenient image of gluttony? We'll never know. But what we do know is this: Frederick's death shifted the royal line. His son would become King George III, the very monarch who would preside over a revolution across the Atlantic. In that sense, the prince's quiet passing, perhaps from nothing more than too many peaches, echoed loudly across the decades. From fruity fates to lofty ambitions, we now soar toward the clouds, guided by the peculiar aspirations of King Philip of France. In an age when hot air balloons were the darlings of Europe's imagination, Philip was drawn to the sky. Upward, toward the heavens, toward a spectacle that promised escape from the muddy realm of politics and into the lightness of flight. But flight, as always, was an unpredictable partner. One ill-constructed balloon, a misjudged gust, or a simple flaw in stitching, and dreams were dashed. Some say Philip's attempt at flight ended not with the majesty of birds, but with the ungraceful thud of earthly return. Whether the story is true or twisted from courtly exaggeration, its symbolism endures. A king who looked to the clouds but fell to the ground, a perfect parable for human ambition. And yet, even in failure, there's a charm, for it is in the trying, in the daring to lift one's feet from the soil, that we glimpse the shape of something hopeful. History has a way of chuckling softly at our missteps, even as it records them in golden ink. And so, from the floating dreams of France, we glide over deserts and riverbanks to ancient Egypt, where the last queen of the Ptolemies faced her end with legendary defiance. Cleopatra, ruler of a fractured empire, diplomat, lover, strategist, and symbol, stood poised as the shadow of Rome fell over her kingdom. Defeat was near, and she knew the fate that awaited conquered queens. So, in a final act of theatrical control, she chose her ending. The story, famously told, speaks of a venomous asp, concealed in a basket of figs, striking her gently and finally. Whether this version is truth or simply the most poetic account to survive, it matters little. Cleopatra's death was a message, a declaration that she would not be paraded through Roman streets, reduced to spectacle. She crafted her exit as carefully as she lived her life, with power, mystery, and intention. And though the asp's bite is now debated by scholars, the deeper story remains the same. Here was a woman who shaped her destiny, even in the end. A ruler whose death still stirs the imagination, rich with symbolism, like the Nile itself, eternal, winding, and unknowable. Let your thoughts settle now in the halls of imperial Russia, where grandeur loomed so large it nearly swallowed reality. And within that splendor walked Tsar Peter III, a man whose reign was as brief as it was bewildering, often remembered more for what he failed to do than for any policy or conquest. Peter's quirks were the stuff of whispered court gossip. He adored playing soldier, obsessively so, marching about his chambers in toy-sized uniforms, pretending at battles while real generals rolled their eyes. But the court could only tolerate so much eccentricity. His wife Catherine, far more ambitious and capable, quietly gathered support. The end came swiftly. Peter was deposed, imprisoned, and soon after dead. The official word was hemorrhoidal colic, but few believed it. More plausible were the whispers that he had been strangled or poisoned, or met his end at the hands of drunken guards, whose clumsy violence sealed his fate. Regardless, the Tsar, who treated power like a game board, was abruptly removed from play. And from that silence rose Catherine the Great, who would rule with fierce intelligence and iron resolve. Peter's strange tenure, marked by childish play acting, became a prologue to an empire transformed by a woman who understood the game far better than he ever had. As we drift deeper into history, we arrive at a tale more surreal than tragic: the death of Sigurd the Mighty, a 9th century Norse earl whose end feels more like folklore than fact. Sigurd, warrior and raider, met his end in a most unlikely way. After defeating an enemy in battle, he had the man's severed head lashed to his horse's saddle as a trophy, perhaps to boast of his conquest. But as the horse galloped on, the dead man's teeth, yes, teeth, grazed Sigurd's leg. The wound festered, infection set in, and the mighty Norseman, slayer of men, was felled by the mouth of a corpse. It almost sounds impossible, like a tale told around fires in smoky longhouses. But whether embellished or not, the truth it hints at remains. Hubris has its price. To flaunt a victory with such arrogance, to carry death as a banner, it invites mischief from the universe. Sigurd's downfall wasn't from an enemy's blade, but from his own pride, turned back on him in the quietest, strangest way. A warning from history wrapped in dark humor. Death doesn't always come with a roar. Sometimes it whispers through a tooth and a wound. And now we find ourselves in an English court again, this time in the 18th century, where King George II lived a life of precision and routine. He was not a dramatic king, not the sort who scrawled manifestos or chased empire dreams with mad-eyed ambition. He preferred structure, like a well-timed clock. And in the end, that very predictability became his epitaph. One October morning, after his usual breakfast, George rose from the table and went to relieve himself. Minutes later, attendants found him collapsed on the floor of his privy. He had died, it seemed, of an aortic dissection, sudden, fatal, and tragically timed. There is a strange intimacy in this detail. A king, one of the most powerful men in Europe, brought low not by enemy forces, but by a fragile vessel inside his own chest. History sometimes prefers its kings to fall on the battlefield, but George II reminds us that death plays no favorites. It doesn't wait for ceremony. It arrives in silence, in the most private of spaces, reducing even monarchs to the same human script as all others. And yet in that quiet dignity there is something comforting, something soft. He left no chaos behind, no civil war, no crisis. Just stillness. From that stillness, we step into something more theatrical, the story of Tycho Brahe, the brilliant Danish astronomer whose death has been debated and dissected for centuries. Though not a king, Brahe moved in royal circles, his mind full of stars and calculations, his manner eccentric and grand. One night, attending a banquet, Brahe refused to leave the table to relieve himself, out of a sense of decorum. Hours passed and the discomfort turned to agony. He died days later, most likely from a burst bladder, or so the story goes. Modern investigations suggest kidney complications, or perhaps mercury poisoning from his scientific work. But the myth persists because it's so perfectly strange. That a man who charted the heavens could be undone by etiquette, by pride, by not wanting to appear impolite. There's a poetry to that. A reminder that intellect and mortality are uneasy bedfellows, that even those who map the cosmos remain bound to the body. As Brahe looked to the stars, he might never have imagined that his own ending would be so earthbound, so humbling. A celestial mind, brought low by something as simple as waiting too long. Then there's Adolf Fredrik, King of Sweden, a ruler whose life was largely uneventful, but whose death reads like an overindulgent fable. On Fat Tuesday in 1771, he sat down to a royal feast. Lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, smoked herring, champagne, and most infamously, 14 servings of semla, a sweet roll soaked in hot milk and spiced with cardamom. He ate and ate and ate, and shortly after he died. Whether it was digestive failure, a stroke, or a combination of indulgences, we can't be sure. But the legacy remains, the king who ate himself to death. It's a story both comic and grotesque, decadent and strangely fitting. A monarch whose name is remembered not for laws or battles, but for dessert. And in that memory there is a kind of immortality. We laugh gently, we wonder, we shake our heads, and history, ever the sly recorder, adds one more page to its book of improbable exits. A feast turned fatal, a legacy shaped by a spoon. From sweet rolls and royal feasts, we make our way into the shadowed corridors of ancient Rome, where Gaius Caligula, emperor, enigma, and tyrant, met a fate as violent as his reign. His end came not through misstep or misfortune, but by the very hands of those who had once bowed before him. The Praetorian Guard, sworn to protect him, turned inward, blade by blade. Their plot was born in whispers, deep beneath the noise of imperial excess, until one day they struck stab after stab in the corridors of his own palace. Unlike the others, Caligula's death was neither poetic nor ironic. It was raw, bloody, and calculated, a deliberate cutting away of what had become intolerable. He had pushed the boundaries of power until those beneath him could stomach no more. In his death we find no soft lesson, only the inevitable end of unchecked madness. Sometimes history doesn't twist with a wink. Sometimes it just snaps. And yet even here in the chaos there's a strange sort of sleepiness, because even the loudest lives must eventually go still. From that violence we shift to something more mundane, but no less strange. The curious death of Aeschylus, one of the great playwrights of ancient Greece. Legend tells that he died not by blade or age, but by a falling tortoise. Dropped from above by an eagle mistaking his bald head for a stone, Aeschylus met his end in a moment that sounds more like myth than record. But the Greeks were fond of meaning, and this story endures precisely because it feels like the gods having a laugh, testing fate on the very man who once shaped tragedies with ink and chorus. Whether true or not, the image lingers. A quiet walk under a sun-drenched sky, a shadow passing overhead, and then the final absurd note of life. It is, in its way, an oddly fitting exit for a man who spent his life defining drama. No stage, no script, just a tortoise and a sky and the hum of ancient fate. And perhaps in this, a reminder to look up now and then, not in fear but in wonder. We drift now to the court of Attila the Hun, that thunderous conqueror known as the Scourge of God. His life was fire and charge, battlefield and blood, but his death came in stillness on his wedding night. Attila, who had survived countless wars, who'd shattered cities and terrified empires, died from a nosebleed. A ruptured vessel, most likely caused by heavy drinking, went unnoticed while he slept, and the warlord drowned in his own blood. It's hard to imagine such a fearsome figure meeting such a passive end. No clash of swords, no final defiant stand. Just silence. It's a paradox, and one that history savors, that even the most aggressive lives are subject to the small betrayals of the body. And so Attila, rider, raider, ruler, rode off not in war but in slumber, the weight of the world finally stilled. Another curious tale lies in the death of Basil I, the Byzantine emperor who founded a dynasty but couldn't escape the bite of chance. According to one version of his death, Basil died after being dragged by his hunting cloak, caught on the antlers of a deer. The emperor was pulled along like a rag doll through the brush, his dignity shredded by branches, his yells lost in the noise of the hunt. It sounds too strange to be true, and it may well be. Other sources suggest a fever, but the image has stuck. Emperor tangled in the wild, undone by an animal he never feared. It's easy to see why the story endured, part tragic, part comic, all human. The man who ruled palaces in policy, brought low by nature, by the forest, by fabric. The forest doesn't know kings. It pulls equally, regardless of birth or crown. From the underbrush of Byzantium, we return to a darker, more intimate moment. This time in Sweden, where King Charles XII met death with eerie precision. He was inspecting trenches during battle, peering over the edge when a bullet struck his temple. Clean, swift, final. Some believe it was the enemy. Others whisper it was his own men, weary of his endless war. Either way, Charles, who had lived with single-minded martial focus, died in one silent breath. It was, for all its violence, a strangely quiet end for a man so obsessed with movement and strategy. No fanfare, no final speech, just the thump of a body into the mud. And yet, that image says enough. Sometimes the game simply ends, and the board is wiped clean. As we close this meandering path through history's strangest farewells, one final tale waits in the shadows. Not of a king, but of a philosopher, Chrysippus of Soli. A man of logic, of words, of thought. His mind danced through stoicism and reason, charting systems of ethics and discipline. And yet he died, laughing. Reportedly, he saw a donkey eating figs and joked that the animal should be given wine to wash them down. The image struck him so funny, he laughed until he could breathe no more. It's ridiculous, and it's perfect. A philosopher brought low not by argument or illness, but by joy. It is, in its way, the happiest death in this entire storybook. Death by amusement. The end punctuated not by silence, but by cackling glee. And perhaps in that, there's a small lesson for us all, to find humor even at the edge. So now, dear listener, the thread draws closed. From tortoise to tennis, from battlefields to banquet halls, we've wandered gently through the winding garden of peculiar passings. And in each tale, some small truth, that death, when it comes, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it chuckles, sometimes it tiptoes, and sometimes it trips over its own feet and drops a fig along the way. Let the softness of these stories lull you into the quiet beyond, where even kings, queens, and philosophers sleep, and you may join them, just for a while. Let's begin again with the candle-lit hush of the palace halls, this time in Renaissance Florence, where Giovanni Maria Visconti, Duke of Milan, met an end that felt like a morality play stitched into the brickwork of his city. Giovanni was not loved. He ruled with cruelty and suspicion, his punishments swift and often theatrical. So when the conspirators came for him, they didn't tiptoe. They waited for him outside church, on holy ground, and struck with blades glinting beneath their cloaks. 17 wounds, a sacred place stained red. There's something quietly symbolic in it, that a man who ruled through fear met his end in a space built for peace, that even marble columns and stained glass light could not shield a tyrant from the return of his own shadow. And after his death, the city breathed easier, as if some heavy curtain had lifted. The bells rang, not for mourning, but for release. And though he was buried with ceremony, the people remembered the echo of his scream more than any sermon read at his tomb. We move now to China, to the later years of the Tang dynasty, where Emperor Xianzong fell not to a sword or to sickness, but perhaps to his own courtly apothecary. It's said the emperor placed great faith in an alchemist, a man who promised elixirs of eternal life. He drank from golden vials, infused with mercury and mystery, believing each drop would stretch his rule beyond mortal limits. But death, it seems, had its own timetable. His health faltered, mind grew cloudy, and he faded, some say poisoned slowly by the very medicine he trusted. It's a cautionary tale as old as empires, the pursuit of immortality bringing about the very thing it seeks to avoid. Xianzong was not the first, nor the last, to chase that glittering illusion. but his story remains etched into history like a soft sigh. An emperor who thought he could outlast time, and instead sped toward it, one silver sip at a time. Now let us enter the wilds of medieval Hungary, where Bela I, king and warrior, ruled amid political storms and shifting alliances. Toward the end of his reign, with tensions rising and threats mounting, Bela took to his throne. But this wasn't the gilded, padded seat of courtly luxury. It was a wooden platform hastily built in a camp during a military maneuver. And when he sat, it collapsed. The fall shattered his bones. He died from the injuries not long after. Simple, brutal, almost comedic in its suddenness. A king crushed by the symbol of his own authority. The chair couldn't hold him, and perhaps that says more than it should. Thrones, no matter how carved or ornate, are still just furniture. And when they fall apart, so do the people who rest on them. And from the thrones of Hungary we now turn to the slopes of the Alps, where the Duke of Brunswick, Charles II, met an end more cinematic than ceremonial. Exiled and aging, Charles had fled to Geneva, carrying with him the wealth of his once vast influence. One day, in an oddly reflective mood, he ventured into the mountains. His guide, ill-prepared for the terrain, lost his footing. The Duke, trying to help, slipped himself, his body tumbling through ice and stone until silence claimed him. There's something about the mountains that makes this feel right, in a strange way. A man who rose and fell with the tides of politics, brought down not by plot but by the indifference of stone and gravity. No one plotted his death. No crowd watched. Just cold air, snow-damp boots, and the long tumble into obscurity. Sometimes the mountain doesn't need a reason. Let's descend now, gently, into more modern times, where the tragic death of King Ananda Mahidol of Thailand still stirs uneasy silences. In 1946, the young king, just 20, was found dead in his bed from a gunshot wound. To this day, the truth remains cloaked in questions. Suicide, accident, or assassination? Official explanations shifted and rumors bloomed. He had been shy, deeply private, and struggling beneath the enormity of his role. His passing left a nation stunned, and the mystery only deepened the grief. What remains is not just a case file, but a feeling. A quiet sorrow for a life too short, a ruler barely begun, a chapter closed before the page could turn. In the stillness of that royal bedroom, in the hush that followed, you can almost hear the click of a clock stopping. History paused, then changed course entirely. And finally, for now, we drift to a tale whispered along the Rhine, where Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, met a most anticlimactic end for a man of his stature. On crusade, he approached the Salif River. Determined to cross it without aid, perhaps out of pride, perhaps haste, he entered the water alone. Whether it was the current or his heavy armor that pulled him under, no one knows. But he drowned. A legend extinguished not by battle but by water. His soldiers, stunned, watched the might of Europe vanish into a quiet stream. And though his body was eventually recovered, he never reached the Holy Land. Some say he sleeps still, buried in a hidden cave, waiting to rise again when the empire needs him. But for now, we remember only the ripples in the water, the flash of metal, the gurgled end of a king too confident to ask for help. Let us begin again beneath the gilded canopy of ancient Persia, where Artaxerxes II, a king of vast reach and complicated rule, is said to have died not from poison or dagger, but from grief. His favored wife and most trusted queen, Statira, passed unexpectedly. And the king, so the story goes, faded soon after her, wasting away in mourning, as if his body simply chose not to carry on without her presence. In an age of empires and endless conquest, it is striking to find a death born not from battle, but from love. A soft, aching kind. The sort that hollows a person gently. Perhaps it wasn't just her absence, but the unraveling of order that followed. Power depends so much on balance, between people, between loyalties, between routines. And when one pillar falls, sometimes the whole structure trembles. His was a death of silence, of dimmed torches and unopened scrolls. And maybe that is its own kind of power, the proof that even kings are made vulnerable by the quietest forms of loss. We step next into the windswept fields of Scotland, where James II of Scotland, young, ambitious, and fond of artillery, met an end more explosive than poetic. In 1460, during a siege on Roxburgh Castle, James brought with him one of his prized cannons, a great iron beast, meant to impress both friend and enemy. But as he stood near it, issuing orders and admiring the weapon, the cannon misfired. It exploded. Shrapnel tore through the air, and just like that, the king was gone, undone by his own enthusiasm for the future of warfare. There's something jarringly modern about his fate. Fire, metal, science, the tools of progress turning back on their wielder. His death served as a chilling reminder that innovation, no matter how promising, is never without its dangers. And though the siege carried on, the air was thick with something heavier than gunpowder. A king lost to a weapon not of the enemy's making, but his own. Ambition can be flammable. Now turn your thoughts to France once again, this time to the polished salons of the Enlightenment, where Jean-Baptiste Lully, the composer most beloved by King Louis XIV, led orchestras with a long, ornate staff. It was not just for style, it was tradition. The staff was used to beat time on the floor in place of modern conducting. But one day, while leading a Te Deum to celebrate the king's recovery from illness, Lully struck his own foot with the staff. He dismissed the wound. It became infected. He refused amputation. And so, from a single rhythmic misstep came death. The irony glimmers faintly, like candlelight on polished wood. A man who moved through life to music, brought down by the very act of making it. A servant of celebration, dying in the echo of joy. His final note was not sung, but stepped upon. And as his compositions faded into the court's memory, so too did the image of that long, pointed staff, laid aside forever. We drift further east now, to the imperial courts of China under the reign of the Ming dynasty, where the Wanli emperor ruled for decades, but is remembered more for retreat than command. Toward the end of his life, Wanli withdrew almost entirely from court affairs, attending few meetings, signing fewer decrees. He became a ghost within his own palace, wrapped in layers of silk and silence. When he finally passed, it was with little fanfare, a long decline into sleep after years of existing only in name. His is a death not of surprise, but of distance, a fading of flame rather than an extinguishing. It speaks to the exhaustion of leadership, the slow erosion of will beneath decades of scrutiny and ceremony. There was no enemy at the gates, no rebellion, just the quiet surrender of a man who had grown tired of being emperor. And in that weariness, perhaps, a mirror to all of us, reminding that power is not always a thing to be clutched. Sometimes it is simply, let go. Let us leave the palaces now, and follow the ocean breeze to the remote shores of the Pacific, where King Kamehameha II of Hawaii and his queen, Kamamalu, made a fateful journey to London. It was 1824, and they came not as conquerors or diplomats of war, but as curious guests, eager to understand the great world beyond their islands. But Europe had its own invisible weapons. Within weeks of arriving, both the king and queen contracted measles, a disease their immune systems had never encountered. They died far from home, in gray foreign rooms, surrounded by unfamiliar customs and distant skies. Their passing was mourned deeply in Hawaii, where chants and wails echoed over volcanic cliffs and moonlit beaches. The journey had been a gesture of respect, a step toward alliance, but it ended in silence. Their deaths remind us that the dangers of exploration are not always marked with maps. Sometimes, they travel in the air itself. We turn now to the shadowed corners of Rome, where Pope John XII, young and wild, became head of the Catholic Church with a mind still tuned to pleasures more earthly than spiritual. His papacy was turbulent, scandalous, and filled with rumors of affairs, parties, and reckless decisions. And according to legend, he died in the most unexpected of ways. While in bed with a married woman, either from a stroke or, as some claim, at the hands of her husband who found them together and dealt swift, vengeful justice. Fact and fable have long danced around this story, and it's hard to separate the two. But the image has endured. A holy man dying in unholy circumstances, perhaps struck not just by fate but by irony itself. He was meant to be a shepherd, but he wandered far from the fold. And so his end became a lesson whispered through centuries of cathedral stone, that titles alone cannot sanctify a soul. So many endings, so many strange, tangled threads. Some unravel slowly in shadow, others snap without warning. But all of them in their own way remind us of the same thing, that no matter how powerful or wise, how grand or infamous, we all walk the same crooked road towards stillness. We begin again in the royal courts of ancient Babylon, where King Belshazzar hosted a lavish feast while his enemies gathered at the gates. Wine flowed, gold gleamed, and the air was thick with hubris. But amid the revelry, a hand ghostly and unseen wrote upon the palace wall. The message, simple and chilling: mean Tekel a parson, you have been weighed, you have been found wanting. Belshazzar's death came that very night. The Persians, silent and efficient, slipped through the city's defenses. The feast ended in blood and silence. It is a story soaked in symbolism, the final act of a ruler so lost in his own decadence that he missed the footsteps in the dark. Whether the writing was divine or poetic myth, it left an echo, a reminder that fate doesn't always tap politely. Sometimes it carves its warnings right into the walls. Now we walk through mists and meadows to the damp green world of medieval Ireland, where Muirchertach Ua Briain, a high king, died not by blade or arrow, but by his bathrobe. He had grown old, and the chill of Irish wind was harsh on aching bones. So he ordered a large wooden tub filled with hot wine, yes, wine not for drinking but for soaking. And into this strange, royal spa he descended. But whether from heat, age, or the sheer absurdity of it all, his body gave out. He died submerged in the drink he so loved, wrapped in steam, surrounded by perfumed stillness. There's something oddly peaceful in the image. A monarch soaking in warmth as the world faded away. Not a battlefield, not a throne, just a wooden tub and the final sigh of old ambition sinking into red. From wine baths to winter storms, we go next to Norway, where King Haakon VII found himself adrift, both literally and metaphorically, during World War II. Fleeing the Nazi invasion, he became a monarch without a kingdom, a symbol carried across snow-covered hills and hostile coasts. He didn't die then. In fact, he survived the war and returned to his people. But his story is stitched with quiet mortality. Years later, weakened by time and sorrow, Haakon passed in his sleep. There was no drama, no accident, just a gentle letting go. And yet, that's what made it powerful. Because sometimes, after the storms and speeches, a king needs only silence. And so he left quietly, like the last snowflake melting on an empty windowsill. We shift now to the dusty grandeur of 19th century America, where President Zachary Taylor, after attending 4th of July celebrations, gorged himself on cold milk, cherries, and iced water beneath the summer sun. Within days, he fell violently ill, possibly from cholera, heat stroke, or spoiled food. He died in office, and though his presidency had barely begun, it ended with a picnic gone wrong. Historians still debate the details. Was it the milk, the fruit, the heat, or simply the poor sanitation of a pre-refrigeration world? Regardless, the moment stands as a strange reminder that even leaders of nations can be undone by summer treats. The imagery clings: stars and stripes, cherry juice, white linen, and then stillness. A man swept away by the very day meant to celebrate endurance. From picnics to poetry, let us visit the final hours of Edgar Allan Poe. Not a king, but a ruler of language, one whose pen built kingdoms of gloom. He was found wandering the streets of Baltimore, delirious, dressed in someone else's clothes. He was taken to a hospital where he muttered nonsense and never recovered. The exact cause remains unknown. Some say alcohol, others rabies, or even political kidnapping. His end was as murky as his tales, and yet it fits. A death like a dream, fragmented and eerie, with no clean explanation. Just shadows. As if the veil he so often wrote about finally pulled him through, gently and without need for answers. We remember the raven but forget the silence that followed. And perhaps for Poe, that silence was the final stanza. Now, across centuries and oceans, we drift to Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia, a ruler who brought railways, telegraphs, and resistance to colonial rule. But in his later years, after a series of strokes, he reportedly began feeding pages of the Bible to his lion, believing it would bring healing or protection. It was grief. It was confusion. It was the slow unraveling of a once brilliant mind. And then it was over. His body lingered, but his voice faded early. His was a death stretched over time, not in violence but in vanishing. Piece by piece, the emperor became legend. The man who once beat back European powers fell not to armies but to the soft dismantling of the self. And in that, there is something deeply human, something tender. Let us end this chapter in the twisting alleys of Renaissance Italy, where Francesco de' Medici, Grand Duke of Tuscany, drank from a glass that would soon become famous. He died along with his wife under suspicious circumstances. Arsenic, they said, or malaria, or both. But the Medici had many enemies and poison was as common as perfume. For centuries the story shifted, natural illness or careful assassination. But in either case it left a taste of bitterness on the tongue of history. The glass on the table, the twitch of suspicion, the silence that follows when laughter stops. Even surrounded by luxury and learning, a Medici could not sip in peace. And so we stop here, for now, surrounded by royal tubs, cherry feasts, wandering poets, and ghostly handwriting on ancient walls. All lives, all ends, wrapped in strangeness and meaning, humor and hush. Even in absurdity, there's something sacred. Let us begin again in the frost-covered silence of Russia, where Tsar Alexander I vanished from life with all the mystery of a man walking out into snow and never quite returning. Officially, he died of typhus in the southern city of Taganrog in 1825, far from the grandeur of St. Petersburg. But rumors soon began to flicker, like candlelight behind frost, that he had faked his death, that he had grown weary of the weight of empire and slipped away into obscurity, becoming a wandering monk known only as Fyodor Kuzmich. The truth, as always, remains elusive. Perhaps he died quietly, full of regret and exhaustion. Or perhaps, in an act of quiet rebellion, he traded a crown for solitude and roamed forests with nothing but his thoughts for company. Either way, his death, or disappearance, left behind more questions than answers. And maybe that's the point. That some exits are less about endings, and more about stepping into the fog where history loses its grip. From snowy winds to golden fields, we go to the brief and baffling reign of Pope Celestine V, an ascetic hermit thrust into the most powerful seat in Christendom. He never wanted it. He preferred caves to cathedrals, silence to politics. But when the cardinals deadlocked, they chose him, perhaps as a holy symbol, perhaps as a pawn. He accepted, and within months, overwhelmed by the spectacle, he resigned. He was the first pope to do so willingly, and what followed was a quieter tragedy. His successor imprisoned him, ostensibly to prevent rivals from using him as a figurehead. He died in confinement, surrounded by stone and echoes, a holy man who'd sought peace, caught in the grinding gears of power. His death wasn't violent, but it was cruel in its stillness. He wanted nothing, and for that, the world gave him everything, and then took it all away. We now tiptoe into the velvet-draped salons of Vienna, where Crown Prince Rudolph of Austria met his end in what is still called the Mayerling incident. The heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire was found dead beside his young lover, Baroness Mary Wetzera, in a hunting lodge. The official cause was a murder-suicide, but conspiracy quickly settled in like thick perfume, questions about mental health, political pressure, and the burdens of imperial duty swirled for decades. Whatever the truth, the image remains. A crown prince, so close to the throne, undone not by bullets from enemies but by sorrow, despair, and the isolation of expectation. Mayerling became a symbol, not just of romance gone wrong, but of how even golden futures can fracture quietly out of sight. Now let your thoughts float eastward to the edge of India's long coastline, where Alauddin Khilji, the powerful Sultan of Delhi, ended his life surrounded not by courtiers or family, but in almost total isolation. Once a fierce and visionary ruler, his later years were marked by paranoia. He trusted no one. Poisoned food, invisible enemies, and silent daggers haunted his imagination, and so he withdrew from even his own court. When he died, many weren't even sure how long he had been gone. The Sultan, who once ruled one of the most formidable armies in Indian history, was ultimately conquered by his own mind. And perhaps that is the softest kind of ending, a ruler so watchful, so burdened by fear that he never saw peace arrive. Just silence, just the end. We walk now through dark English corridors to the story of Henry I's daughter, Empress Matilda, not her death, but the strange slowness of her life's conclusion. After years of fighting for her claim to the throne, years that became a civil war known as the Anarchy, she retreated to Normandy in old age, where she faded from the world like the last embers in a fireplace. She never ruled England, not officially, but her son would. Henry II, the first of the Plantagenets. Her death was not grand. No court wept in public. No tapestries were woven. She slipped into history like a footnote. But that too is a kind of legacy. Some lives aren't measured in battles won, but in doors opened for others. Her ending wasn't spectacular, but her influence outlived her by centuries. Let us drift now to the deserts of Egypt, where the pharaoh Akhenaten, the so-called heretic king, changed everything. He abandoned the old gods. He built a new capital. He declared the sun disk Aten as the one true divine force. His art showed human emotion, tenderness, deformity, and then he disappeared. His death is a mystery, his tomb lost, his remains uncertain. Some believe he was assassinated. Others think he simply fell out of favor and was scrubbed from memory. But what matters is the silence that followed. Egypt turned its back on his revolution, razed his temples, and returned to the gods he had cast aside. The desert reclaimed his legacy. His death, whether abrupt or gradual, was made complete by forgetting. And now, one final passage for this part, into the court of Denmark, where King Christian VII reigned in name but not in truth. He was plagued by mental illness, manipulated by advisors, and locked in a body that ruled nothing. Though alive for decades, Christian was functionally absent. His wife, Queen Caroline Matilda, was exiled. His physician was executed. The regents took control. When he died, it was little more than a formality, a closing of the curtain on a life that had long since left the stage. His was a death that had arrived years before the heart stopped, a living ghost in a gilded cage. So many passings, so many strange silences. Some kings fall from cliffs, some fade in palaces, some vanish entirely. But they all remind us that history's strangest stories don't always shout. They whisper, they linger, they unravel gently like dreams at dawn. We begin this chapter beneath the gray skies of England, where Prince Alfred, the second son of Queen Victoria, died young, quietly, and without much ceremony. Destined for a military career, loved yet overlooked in the shadow of his more prominent siblings, Alfred developed what might today be called melancholia. Whether due to illness, isolation, or the crushing pressure of princely expectations, his light flickered out at just 24. Some say he suffered from a wasting disease. Others whisper of more personal pain. The palace kept the story gentle. No scandal, no drama. Just a passing wrapped in soft fabric and polite silence. And yet, in that hush, you can almost hear the ache. Not every royal story is marked by rebellion or grandeur. Some are simply sad, and in their simplicity, perhaps the most human of all. Let us move eastward now, across wide steppes and frozen plains, to the sudden, almost cinematic death of Leon Trotsky. Though not a monarch, Trotsky's fall was as dramatic as any ruler's. Exiled to Mexico after losing a brutal political battle with Stalin, he lived behind high walls and armed guards, aware every day that his end might come from a visitor with kind eyes and cruel intentions. It did. In 1940, an assassin entered his home posing as a friend and with an ice pick concealed beneath his coat, drove it into Trotsky's skull. But Trotsky, ever the stubborn revolutionary, did not die immediately. He wrestled with his attacker, shouted for help, and lingered in a hospital bed, still debating, still thinking, until his mind could hold on no longer. His was a death marked by betrayal, but also by resistance. A man who knew death was coming, and met it not with a whimper but with bloodied fists and one last argument. From politics to puppetry, we now find ourselves in Florence, where Carlo Lorenzini, better known by his pen name Carlo Collodi, lived his final years in obscurity. The creator of Pinocchio died quietly, with little recognition. Though his story would one day circle the globe, he passed with little more than a nod from the literary world. A writer whose tale about a wooden puppet longing to be real outlived him by centuries. There's a strange poetry in that a man who gave voice to a puppet, who wrote of transformation and longing, would himself slip away without fanfare. No royal funeral, no headlines, just the closing of a notebook, and somewhere, perhaps, the gentle creak of wooden limbs taking one last bow. We now cross the sea to the shores of ancient Britain, where King Edmund Ironside died in the most debated of medieval fashions. Some claim he was stabbed during a secret meeting. Others believe he succumbed to wounds from earlier battle. But the most infamous version, whispered in monasteries and court gossip alike, says he was murdered while relieving himself. An assassin, hidden in the privy pit, drove a blade upward into the king's body at his most vulnerable moment. The image is as bizarre as it is unforgettable, and whether fact or slander, it offers a grim lesson about the costs of power, and how even latrines in stone castles can echo with danger. It is, like many of these tales, both absurd and sobering. A reminder that death does not wait for dignified moments. Let us pause now in France, during the Reign of Terror, where Georges Danton, once a powerful revolutionary, climbed the scaffold. Danton had helped bring down the monarchy, only to be devoured by the very machine he'd helped set in motion. As he approached the guillotine, he turned to the executioner and said, "Show my head to the people. It's well worth seeing." And then silence, one swift slice, a head held aloft, a man reduced to spectacle. It's hard to imagine a more theatrical exit, so aware, so performative, so final. Danton understood what it meant to be remembered, and in that last moment, he carved his own epitaph out of bravado and blood. Now we travel further back, to ancient Athens, where the philosopher Anaxarchus was said to have been captured and tortured by a tyrant. When his body began to fail him, when the pain became unbearable, he looked his tormentor in the eye and spat his tongue out at him, defiant to the end, offering even his last words in silence. Whether the story is true or apocryphal hardly matters. The image lingers, a man so committed to dignity that he weaponized even his final breath. A death not of fear, but of unyielding pride, of control, clung to until the very last twitch of muscle. Let your thoughts drift now to a stranger, colder place, the icy plains of Alaska, where the explorer Henry Hudson met his final horizon. After navigating the river that now bears his name, Hudson's later voyage ended in mutiny. Cast adrift by his own crew, he was placed in a small open boat with his teenage son and a handful of loyal men. No one ever saw them again. No screams, no letters, just the slow hush of snow, the vast silence of northern water. Perhaps he froze. Perhaps he starved. Perhaps he looked up one last time at the stars he'd tried to chase across the map. His death remains one of the great unsolved whispers of the age of exploration, a vanishing, swallowed by white. And lastly for now, we find ourselves back in Japan, within the serene but exacting world of the samurai. Here lived Minamoto no Yoshitsune, a warrior poet whose brilliance in battle was unmatched, but whose fate was sealed by betrayal. Cornered by his own brother, unable to escape, Yoshitsune took his own life in the ritual of seppuku, a deliberate, precise, and deeply symbolic act. But even in death, he left behind something bigger than legacy. He became legend. Some say he didn't die, that he escaped, wandering north, becoming a monk, a traveler, a whisper, or even more curiously, that he crossed the sea and became the legendary Genghis Khan. Of course, none of it's true, but that's the beauty of strange deaths. They never truly end. They just become stories circling forever. So we leave you here on the edge of the map, with kings stabbed in silence, poets forgotten in beds, explorers swallowed by snow, and warriors bowed in shadow. Every one of them, a thread in history's strange and beautiful tapestry of endings. Let us begin this chapter in the windswept sand of the Arabian desert, where Caliph al-Mustasim, the last Abbasid ruler of Baghdad, met a death steeped in eerie symbolism. When the Mongols took the city in 1258, they captured the caliph but chose not to spill his blood. Why? Mongol superstition forbade it. So instead, they wrapped him in a carpet and trampled him to death with horses. It sounds like something from a dream. Fabric muffling screams, hooves pounding over silk, and an empire ending beneath its own woven symbols of status. The caliph, once surrounded by books, scholars, and poets, was folded into the earth like a forgotten relic. A city fell, and with it, 1,000 years of Islamic golden age collapsed, not with a blaze of war, but under the crushing weight of felt and hoof. Now we walk the colder halls of Sweden's royal court to meet King Erik XIV, a monarch whose descent into madness was as steady as snowfall. Brilliant, paranoid, erratic, he lived his final years imprisoned by his own nobles after years of erratic rule, haunted by whispers and ghosts that may or may not have been real. He was poisoned, they say, while eating a bowl of pea soup. There is something chilling in that detail. Not a goblet of wine, not a dagger in the night, but a humble, warm meal, green, steaming, and final, the kind of thing that should comfort. But instead it carried death. The story is debated, of course, but the image remains. A king, spoon in hand, pausing between bites, unaware of the silence curling in behind him. Let your thoughts drift to the ancient world now, where Heraclitus of Ephesus, philosopher of fire and flux, died in a way so strange it reads like irony crafted by the gods. Afflicted by dropsy and convinced he could heal himself, he covered his body in cow dung to draw out the illness. Then he lay under the sun to bake. The dung dried, the sun burned, and Heraclitus, the man who once said, "No man ever steps in the same river twice," stepped out of time altogether. Whether he died of the illness or the treatment hardly matters now. What remains is the quiet image of a thinker undone by his own stubborn wisdom, dissolving into earth, as if seeking to become part of the very flux he so often described. And now to France, again, where King Louis III met one of history's more absurd endings. Riding swiftly on horseback, chasing after a fleeing girl, accounts vary on who she was or why, he struck his head on the lintel of a low doorway. The blow killed him instantly. A prince of power, felled not by war or treason but by poor architecture. The lesson is quiet and perhaps funny in the softest way. Even kings should watch where they're going. And that desire, no matter how royal or reckless, can still run face first into the limits of wood and stone. His crown did not cushion the blow, nor did the history books remember him for much more than that single moment of impulsive pursuit and one terribly timed doorframe. Now we turn to Brazil, where Emperor Pedro I, who declared the country's independence and became its first monarch, lived a life of passion, upheaval, and fierce contradictions. His health declined rapidly after years of political conflict and physical exhaustion, but it was his final request that stands out. Upon his death, he asked for his heart to be removed and placed in a church in Portugal, while the rest of his body remained buried in Brazil. And so it was done. His corpse and his heart lie on separate continents, a body split by history, a man torn, even in death, between the colony he helped birth and the homeland he left behind. It is poetic in a way, the literal separation of loyalty and identity, heart in one land, bones in another. Let's pause now in the pages of the Enlightenment, where the mathematician and philosopher Blaise Pascal, despite his genius, spent much of his life in pain. He died young, just 39, from an illness still debated. But before he passed, he had a curious habit. He would stuff scraps of paper with religious thoughts and observations into the lining of his clothes, like secret messages to himself. After his death, they were discovered, hundreds of them stitched close to his body, as if he could not let his thoughts go, as if he needed them near his skin. His death, quiet and expected, was made strange only by what it revealed, that even the most brilliant minds fear the silence, and that philosophy, when woven into cloth, becomes both burden and comfort. Now we step into the quiet of the stage lights dimming. The year is 1983, and Tennessee Williams, the playwright whose pen shaped a streetcar named Desire and Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, died alone in a hotel room in New York City. The cause? Officially, asphyxiation. He had choked on the plastic cap of a medicine bottle. The news shocked the world, not because of scandal but because it seemed so random, so small. A tiny object, a careless moment, a final breath cut short. It feels like a cruel edit in a story meant to have a grander ending. But maybe that's exactly right. Williams lived in moments. He crafted lives out of longing and error. His own death, an accident of detail, was painfully human. And now, at the edge of Europe, we find King Sebastian of Portugal, who rode into battle in Morocco and never returned. His body was never recovered. He simply vanished. And in his absence, myth bloomed. For centuries, Portuguese citizens believed he would return in Portugal's darkest hour, riding through the fog like Arthur or Frederick Barbarossa. He became a ghost king, a symbol, a hope dressed in armor. His death, though likely in battle, became irrelevant. The real story was the waiting, the idea that a country could tuck its grief into legend and keep a place ready at the table for a monarch who may have drowned long ago. That is a powerful kind of death, one that refuses to die. So here we pause, surrounded by vanished emperors, choking poets, dung-covered philosophers, and kings cut down by door frames. They fade, they vanish, they trip, they melt, but they all leave behind a shape in the fabric of time, a strange little ripple, a name worth whispering just before sleep. Let us begin again in Renaissance Italy, where Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, philosopher, prodigy, and the shining intellect behind the oration on the dignity of man, died under a shadow. He was only 31, healthy, respected, at the height of his intellectual fame, and then, suddenly, gone. Poison was suspected, of course. This was Italy after all, and the Medici circle in which he moved was no stranger to subtle violence. Some claimed it was arsenic. Others whispered of rivalries and secrets buried in ink. But no one could prove it. His death lingered like a question mark at the end of a long, lyrical sentence. A brilliant mind snuffed out, not in fire but in fog. And his words, written to uplift the divine potential of mankind, now read more like an unfinished prayer. From parchment to paint, we move now to the shadowed studios of Vienna, where Egon Schiele's sharp and haunting portraits once stared back at their viewers with angular defiance. He died young, like many artists of his age, swept away by the Spanish flu in 1918, just days after his pregnant wife. He sketched her as she died. Then, 3 days later, followed her into silence. Schiele's end wasn't a mystery. It was a wave, an invisible tide that took millions. But what makes his death feel so strange is the echo it left in his work. The hollow eyes, the twisted limbs, the expressions that seemed, even in life, to know what was coming. It was as if the figures he painted had whispered something back to him, something about endings. And when he listened, he simply vanished into their lines. Let's turn now to the court of ancient Sparta, where Cleomenes I ruled with ambition and instability in equal measure. He reformed. He attacked, he lost, and finally, in a strange turn of events, he was imprisoned in his own land. It was there in his cell that he met his end, not from guards or poison, but by his own hand. According to Herodotus, Cleomenes committed suicide in one of the most bizarre ways ever recorded, by systematically dismembering himself. Now, whether that detail is fact or a flourish of ancient storytelling is hard to say, but the image sticks. A man so consumed by internal chaos that even death became a slow unraveling. A warrior's final battle fought not with enemies but with his own limbs. And in that, we see Sparta not as discipline and order, but as pressure finally bursting. Now drift forward into the dimly lit parlors of 19th century England, where Isambard Kingdom Brunel, engineer of tunnels, ships, and bridges, helped shape the modern world. He smoked constantly, worked endlessly, and when a small coin or piece of food became lodged in his throat, he reportedly tried to dislodge it using a bizarre contraption involving a rope and pulley system. The attempt failed. He suffered a stroke not long after and died. For a man who built the bones of Britain, rails and arches stretching across the land, it's oddly fitting that something so tiny would be his undoing. He designed machines that reshaped continents, yet could not save himself from a misstep of the mouth. That is how it goes sometimes. Titans felled by splinters, mountains falling because of pebbles. Let us now return to Rome, always Rome, where the Emperor Caracalla, fierce and famously cruel, met his end in an utterly ordinary way, stabbed while relieving himself by the roadside. He was traveling to a temple far from his legions and palaces when one of his own soldiers approached. A distraction, a dagger, and that was it. The man who had slaughtered thousands died with his trousers down, staring at the dust. It's almost funny, and perhaps that's the point. Caracalla believed himself invincible, divine even, and yet he was ended not by a battlefield rebellion or uprising, but by convenience, a bad moment, a bored assassin. History rarely bothers with timing, it just acts. From swords to slippers, we now shift to the comfortable yet tragic death of King Albert I of Belgium. In 1934, the beloved monarch set out on a solo climb in the Ardennes, something he often did for solitude. He never returned. His body was found at the base of a cliff, officially an accident, unofficially some suspected murder. Theories bloomed, but the mystery stayed unsolved. What lingers is the image. A king who ruled through war and loss, finally alone in the trees, reaching for the sky one last time and missing his grip. Whether it was accident or arrangement, it doesn't matter now. The forest holds the answer, and it is not telling. Let us pause now in France again, because France always gives us one more story, where Jean-Baptiste Lully, court composer to Louis XIV, died of rhythm. He was conducting a performance in honor of the king's recovery, using a long staff to mark time, as was tradition. In his fervor, he struck his own foot. The wound became infected. He refused to have the leg amputated, fearing he would never dance again. He died. It is both ironic and strangely beautiful. A man whose entire life pulsed with music, ending in a final, fatal beat. He died because he loved the timing too much, the rhythm too perfectly. He refused silence, and silence in turn embraced him. Now we look to Korea, where Queen Min, the Empress of Joseon, met one of the most brutal and tragic deaths in modern royal history. She was a powerful, intelligent strategist who resisted Japanese influence in the late 1800s. One night, agents stormed the palace. She was dragged from her chambers, stabbed. Her body burned in the forest beyond the palace gates. Her death was meant to erase her, but it didn't. She became a national symbol, a martyr, a shadow that refused to fade. Her death was loud, terrifying, and unjust, but in it she became unmovable. History tried to close the book. She tore out the last page. So many endings, some tiny, some brutal, some comic, and some too sad to describe. A forest, a fig, a dagger, a spoon, a staircase, a slip. The world turns, the crown topples, the philosopher slips into mud, and history, ever patient, keeps writing. Not with judgment, just with a pen and a quiet kind of smile. Let us begin again with the echoing marble of the Byzantine Empire, where Emperor Leo V met a death foretold not by oracles or dreams, but by the choir of his own cathedral. It was Christmas Day, 820, and Leo was at morning mass, surrounded by icons and incense. The conspirators came dressed as monks, their daggers hidden in robes that should have held only prayer. They waited until the hymn began, then surged forward and struck him down before the altar. The choir kept singing. There's a stillness in that moment that lingers, the echo of sacred music, unmoved by murder. A man who clung fiercely to religious reform, cut down in the middle of his own sacred observance. His killers were swift, the hymn uninterrupted. History doesn't pause for drama. It often continues singing as though nothing happened at all. Now let us follow the stone roads to the battered edges of ancient Gaul, where Marcus Junius Silanus, a once-trusted governor of Rome, found himself suddenly and fatally unfavored. He did not die in war. He was not poisoned in secrecy. His life simply became politically inconvenient. And so, in the quiet way of Roman executions, a centurion appeared with a short sword and no explanation. He offered Silanus the blade. The message was clear. In the world of emperors, death was a ritual, not a sentence. Silanus bowed his head and fell on his sword. His death wasn't famous, but it was practiced. Sterile, forgettable. That was the point. The Romans believed that not all deaths should echo. Some should disappear like breath on marble. From marble to maple trees, we step gently into the stillness of New England, where Nathaniel Hawthorne, author of The Scarlet Letter, died in his sleep during a trip with his dear friend Franklin Pierce, the former president. They were traveling together through New Hampshire, hoping the fresh air would revive Hawthorne's failing health. It didn't. Pierce found him in the morning, still in bed, eyes closed, a pen in his bag. No drama, just a friend gone. There's something haunting about the idea that Hawthorne, who spent his life crafting moral parables of guilt, shame, and redemption, passed away under the quiet gaze of a companion who once held the nation's highest office. No last words, no confession, just absence. Now let's turn our eyes to a sunlit hillside in Bhutan, where Jigme Dorji Wangchuck, the Dragon King, reformer, and father of modern Bhutan, died not in a palace, but in a hospital in Nairobi, far from home. His health had faltered for years, but he continued pushing reforms, democratic structures, healthcare modernization. And yet, when the moment came, it did not come in the sacred highlands or the rhythm of Buddhist prayer, but under fluorescent lights in Africa, his body failing in exile from his own altitude. There is something gently heartbreaking in that. A king who tried to drag his kingdom into the modern world, passing alone on another continent. But still, his people lit butter lamps in every village. Monks chanted through the mist, and the mountains remembered him, even if his final breath didn't rise among them. Let us wander now to France once more, where the final king of a final moment, Louis Philippe, met his end in quiet exile in England. After fleeing revolution, he lived in Claremont House, far from the angry crowds that had once adored him. There, surrounded by family and faded paintings of better days, he simply stopped. No coup, no guillotine, just time and the slow unraveling of memory. It's strange, in a way, to imagine a king dying in someone else's country, beneath someone else's sky, without a single sword drawn. His reign had once been called the bourgeois monarchy, a rule by the middle for the middle. His death, entirely middle, of the pack, of the age, of the quiet. He died as history shifted beneath him and barely made a sound. Now we turn to the curious death of King Umberto I of Italy, who fell not to age or disease, but to coincidence layered with bullets. In 1900, he awarded a restaurant owner a medal for bravery. That man, also named Umberto, also born on the same day in the same town, was murdered the next day. And so was the king, assassinated by an anarchist in Monza. The strange symmetry of their lives, names, dates, destinies, brought whispers of fate. Some say the king's death was foretold in that mirror-like meeting, that the universe had already begun its winding down. It's a story that feels made up, like the kind of ghost tale you might hear beside a dying fire. But it happened, and it reminds us that sometimes death doesn't knock, it reflects. Let us move now to the brutal plains of the Mongol Empire, where the mighty Genghis Khan died not in battle, but, if legend is to be believed, by falling off his horse. Other accounts say it was illness, or assassination, or exhaustion, but the simplest version remains the strangest: the great conqueror who reshaped continents, undone by gravity and speed. Afterward, his body was buried in a secret grave. The funeral escort reportedly killed everyone they encountered on the way back to protect the secret. Then they, too, were killed. Horses were run across the site to flatten the earth. Trees planted. The burial lost forever. That a man so enormous in history could vanish so completely, it is its own kind of poetry. The world bends around his shadow, but his bones lie nowhere and everywhere at once. Finally, let us drift across the Atlantic to the quiet departure of President James Buchanan. Often ranked near the bottom of U.S. presidential lists, Buchanan's legacy was shadowed by indecision during the years leading to the Civil War. He died in his home, almost forgotten by the country he had once tried, weakly, some say, to hold together. His final words were said to be, "Whatever the result may be, I shall carry to my grave the consciousness that I at least meant well for my country." And there it is, a gentle, tragic admission. Not greatness, not resolve, just intention. He died not in disgrace, but in quiet irrelevance. And in that, perhaps, is the softest ending of all. So we pause again with carpets and coin chokes, candle-lit music and nameless graves. These stories do not thunder, they do not roar, but they tap gently at the window of sleep and whisper. Even history forgets how to end things sometimes. Let us begin again in the wind-etched stone of Montségur, a fortress atop a crag in southern France, where the last of the Cathars, followers of a heretical Christian sect, met an ending that burned slowly into the soul of Europe. In 1244, after months of siege, the stronghold surrendered. Around 200 men, women, and children who refused to renounce their faith were led down the mountain and burned alive in a mass pyre. They did not scream, according to chroniclers. They sang, hymns rising above the flames. Whether that detail is true or stylized doesn't matter. It is the note that lingers, a faith declared in smoke. No kings here, no thrones. Just conviction turned to ash. And yet their memory stained the hills, and for centuries afterward, wildflowers refused to grow in the spot where they died. Or so the story goes. We now cross to the icy heart of Finland, where King Charles XII of Sweden makes a second appearance, because his death refuses to settle. You've heard the first version. A bullet to the head during battle, clean and sudden. But others whispered darker truths. That the fatal shot came not from enemy lines but from behind. That one of his own officers, tired of endless war and royal obstinacy, pulled the trigger and let the future unfold. His gloves, coat, and hat were later examined. The whole was too neat, too precise. A suspicious precision. And in that suspicion, a second death bloomed, not of flesh, but of legacy. Charles the warrior became Charles the martyr, or Charles the fool, or Charles the betrayed. When facts crumble, myth fills the cracks. Sometimes the most peculiar deaths are not strange in how they happen, but in how they are remembered. Let us descend now into the humid corridors of South America, where Simon Bolivar, the liberator of nations, spent his final days not in triumph but in exile, coughing into handkerchiefs stained with blood. He had given everything, revolutions, battles, constitutions, and in return he was cast out by the very people he helped free. He died in a borrowed house, alone, disillusioned, his body broken by tuberculosis, his spirit hollowed by betrayal. In his final letter he wrote, "America is ungovernable. Those who have served the revolution have plowed the sea." No fanfare, no gun salute, just silence. A man who redrew the map and then watched it erase his name. We now return to the strange elegance of the English countryside, where Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, met death beneath the vaulted arches of his own cathedral. It was 1170. 4 knights acting, so they claimed, on the unspoken desire of King Henry II confronted him in the shadowed choir. They struck, sword upon skull, blood splashed the altar, and Becket fell. The man who had defied the crown for the sake of the cloth was now cloth-stained crimson. Yet in dying, he was reborn as a symbol. Pilgrims came. Miracles were whispered. The site of his murder became a shrine. It's strange how death can elevate what life merely tolerated. Sometimes the loudest sermons are preached by a silence left behind. Next, we move across the water to Iceland, where Snorri Sturluson, the great saga writer, lawman, and poet, was killed not for his words but because of them. He knew too much, wrote too much, aligned himself with too many. So when power shifted and patience waned, a group of armed men entered his house and found him in his cellar. He reportedly said as they approached, "Do not strike." But they did, a blade in the dark. The man who wrote history became its footnote. His blood mingled with the dust of the manuscripts he had once composed. You can still visit the place, still feel the hush in the stones. His sagas outlived his breath. And maybe that's the best revenge, to be read long after your killers are buried and nameless. Now let us pause for a quieter soul, Jane Austen. She died young at just 41 in a small house in Winchester, her health slowly collapsing from what might have been Addison's disease, Hodgkin's lymphoma, or something else entirely. She wrote to the end, polite letters, calm thoughts, but in those final days her body betrayed her. The wit remained sharp, the hands began to fail. There was no grand farewell, just a sister's tear, a simple headstone, and then over time the slow explosion of fame. Her death was uneventful, her afterlife, a library of voices and velvet words. She left quietly. Her stories never did. Let's turn now to ancient Athens once more, where Demosthenes, the famed orator, fled from the forces of Macedon. He had long fought with his voice, rallying his people against tyranny with speeches carved from thunder. But words cannot stop swords forever. Hunted and cornered in a temple, he took poison from a reed hidden in his robe. There's a peculiar grace in it. A man who lived through his tongue, dying by it. A final act of defiance, of control. Even silence for him had to be a speech. Now we make our way to the New World, where Hernando de Soto, Spanish explorer and relentless seeker of gold, died somewhere along the banks of the Mississippi River. The exact spot is unknown. His men, fearing the wrath of the local tribes who believed him a god, buried his body secretly at night, and later cast it into the water so the illusion of divinity might remain. And so he vanished, man turned myth, turned fishbone, a conquistador whose legacy was paved in ruin, now dissolved beneath the current of the river he claimed to have discovered. The land remembers, but not gently. Lastly for now, we visit the isolated realm of Bhutan again, not for a king, but for the strange tale of a reincarnated lama who, upon feeling death's approach, instructed his followers to bury him in a standing position, upright, facing east. They did, and now, in a small stupa on a wind-blown hill, he rests not lying down but standing watch. There's something beautiful in that, an ending that refuses the traditional pose. A reminder that even in death, some souls prefer to keep looking forward. And so we pause again in the long hallway of peculiar endings, some kneeling, some upright, some sung, some choked in soup, and all of them somehow still echoing. A soft parade of departures, wrapped not in glory but in irony, quiet choice, or fading breath. We begin this chapter in the ancient walled city of Thebes, where Epaminondas, one of Greece's greatest generals, fell not with a scream, but with a silence as deliberate as his battle plans. At the Battle of Mantinea, he was struck by a spear that pierced through his chest and pinned his fate to the earth. When his men gathered around him, they begged for orders, but he would not speak, not until he knew whether his army had won. When told they had, he broke the shaft of the spear himself, and died. It was a death that mimicked his life, strategic, disciplined, and waiting for confirmation before letting go. No theatrics. Just a man lying in the dirt, taking stock of his legacy before permitting his own silence. A general who made his end an epilogue to a final victory. And when the sun fell that day, it fell over Thebes, which would never quite rise the same way again. Now let us move north to the sharp winds of Denmark, where Tyge Brahe, better known as Tycho, still casts a shadow, though his story was already told. But perhaps we linger here again because some stories resist being finished. Tycho's death was long believed to be caused by politeness, holding his bladder too long at a royal banquet. But later analyses suggested mercury poisoning. Whether accident, experiment, or something darker remains unclear. And so we revisit him, not to clarify but to rest with the mystery. That's the thing with strange deaths. They don't always invite answers. Sometimes they just want company. We drift next to the glowing palaces of Mughal India, where Emperor Jahangir, lover of art, opium, and exquisite words, died not in battle, not in revolt, but on a return journey from Kashmir. He had grown old, and the climb through the mountain passes taxed him. He slipped into illness, into fever, into sleep. But it is the way his body was returned that lingers. Concealed in a palanquin, surrounded by loyal retainers, dressed in layers of incense and silence, they carried him for days. He did not lie in state. He rode through hills wrapped in secrecy, so the empire might not learn too soon that it was already missing its center. He died, and for a time no one knew. His breath gone, but his shadow still moving. Now across the sands to North Africa, where Queen Dihya, Berber war leader and fierce resistor of Arab expansion in the 7th century, met her end in a blaze of defiance. Some say she was killed in battle, others that she took her own life when defeat became inevitable. But all accounts agree. She did not yield. She ruled with fire, and she left with it. Her name whispered still in the wind that snakes through the ruins of her kingdom. No monument, no tomb, just desert and legend. A queen who preferred ashes to surrender, and who, in choosing that, became something larger than borders or maps. We now pass into 19th century Europe, where George IV of the United Kingdom, once Prince Regent, once resplendent in silks and scandal, died slowly, bloated and sickly, alone in his room. He was obsessed with his appearance, with power, with extravagance. But in the end, even the mirrors seemed to abandon him. He lingered in pain, his breath heavy with the burden of decades of overindulgence. His last years were not glamorous. He could barely walk, could barely breathe. He lived in a palace but was a prisoner of his own body. The king who had once dazzled with velvet and diamonds died in a stained shirt, breathing through opium and regret. Let us now visit a stranger soul, Grigory Rasputin, the Russian mystic, healer, prophet, and villain, depending on which page of history you read. His death was legendary for its absurd persistence. Poisoned first, shot again, beaten, finally drowned in the icy Neva River. And yet when they found his body, it was said his arms were raised as though trying to break through the surface of the ice. Was it real, exaggerated, a warning wrapped in fable? No one can say for certain. But what remains is that image, ice above, arms beneath. A man who would not die politely. And perhaps that too is its own kind of poetry. Rasputin didn't exit history. He clawed at it. Now to a quieter end in the middle of the Pacific, where Captain James Cook, famed explorer and cartographer, was killed on the shores of Hawaii after relations soured with the local people. He had returned to the islands once too often. Arguments flared. Stones were thrown. Spears followed. And on a beach once covered in welcome, he fell stabbed in the surf, water soaking his boots. It was not a death scripted in grandeur, just sudden, final, a reminder that even explorers eventually reach the end of the map, and that sometimes it is not monsters waiting beyond the edge, but people tired of being mapped. Let us pause now at a grave with no name, because we do not know it. Somewhere along the Great Wall of China, thousands of workers were buried alive during its construction, whether through collapse, exhaustion, or imperial cruelty. The wall was built not just with stone but with bones. We remember the emperor, the generals, the structure itself, but the ones who died inside it, they became the wall, and maybe that's the most haunting end of all. Not to be mourned or named, but to become part of the thing that killed you. And lastly, for now, we come to Oscar Wilde. Brilliant, witty, torn apart by scandal and prison, he died in a cheap Paris hotel, surrounded not by admirers but by peeling wallpaper and coughs. His final words, perhaps apocryphal, are said to be, "Either that wallpaper goes or I do." And then he did. It's too perfect, too sharp, too Wilde, which is why we believe it even if it's fiction. Because some people write their final moments into existence, and when the breath leaves their body, the words don't. They stay, they laugh, they linger in wallpaper and in memory. So here we rest again, beside queens in ash, generals pinned to dirt, mystics clawing through ice, and a poet who couldn't stand the Daker. All of them gone, none of them truly silent. History, like a lullaby, keeps humming their names. We begin this chapter in the smoky marble halls of ancient Rome, where Lucius Annius Seneca, philosopher, playwright, and reluctant advisor to Nero, met his death with a strange, composed theatricality. Accused of conspiracy, sentenced to die, Seneca chose not to protest. Instead, he called his scribes his friends and prepared his death as one might prepare a final act on stage. He opened his veins, slowly, quietly, but the blood did not flow fast enough. So he drank poison. Still, death would not come. His body resisted. Finally, a hot bath was drawn and he slipped into it, letting the steam draw out what remained of life. Imagine it. A stoic thinker, quoting calmly as he bled, his students at his side, the water warming to red. His body died slowly. His dignity didn't. A man who taught others how to die well, showing them in slow motion exactly how. Now drift with me into the cold, cluttered house of Howard Carter, the man who discovered the tomb of Tutankhamun. He did not die by Pharaoh's curse, as the stories like to pretend. No sudden scorpion sting or crumbling tombstone. Just Hodgkin's lymphoma, a slow descent, a quiet room. But in his final days he was surrounded by rumors, his colleagues dead in strange ways, coincidences stacking like bones. Carter ignored them all. He had found the boy king, cracked open a sealed silence, and brought the past roaring into the present. When he died, he left behind not fear, but fascination. The man who unlocked the most famous tomb in history now rests in a far less famous one. On his grave, "May your spirit live, may you spend millions of years, you who love Thebes, sitting with your face to the north wind." The same words once whispered for a pharaoh, a shared wind, a quiet echo. Now let us rise into thinner air, to Bolivia, where Simón Bolívar's fellow revolutionary, Antonio José de Sucre, met a stranger end. He was walking alone through the mountains when he was ambushed and shot, his body left on the trail. The death was political, of course, but also personal. Jealousy, fear, shifting loyalties, all stirred into the mix. His name was not forgotten, but his grave has never been entirely certain. A liberator with no known resting place. A silence that hums in the hills. And it reminds us that the mountains, too, can bury things. Men, empires, regrets, without needing soil. Now step with me into the dusty workshop of Archimedes in the waning days of Syracuse, as Roman soldiers stormed the city. He was drawing circles in the sand when they came. "Do not disturb my circles," he is said to have said, an appeal to geometry in the face of conquest. A soldier, perhaps impatient, ran him through with a blade. It doesn't matter if it happened exactly that way. What matters is that this is how we remember him, not as a victim, but as a man too absorbed in thought to notice death approaching. Killed not because of who he was, but because of how much he was still trying to understand. Even in dying, he was solving. Let us now enter the murky waters of the Mississippi, where jazz legend Bessie Smith met her end not on stage, but on the road. Her car crashed near Clarksdale, Mississippi. She survived the impact but bled heavily. The real tragedy came next. One hospital refused to treat her because she was black. By the time help arrived elsewhere, she was gone. They called her the Empress of the Blues, and in that moment the nation she had sung for turned away, politely and lethally. Her voice could shake walls, but in death it could not open doors. It is a reminder not just of her loss, but of what kind of silence is left behind when music is denied justice. We move now to Paris in the time of revolutions, where Jean-Paul Marat, pamphleteer, firebrand, voice of fury, was murdered in his bath by Charlotte Corday. She came with a list of names. She left with blood on her hands. He died clutching his writing board, half immersed, the water going red. His was not a peaceful death, but it was an iconic one. Immortalized in Jacques-Louis David's painting, Marat became a martyr draped in fabric and irony. A man who stirred violence, undone by its simplest form, a knife in the bath. One moment he was printing names for death. The next he became one of them. Let us turn east now to the imperial court of Japan, where Emperor Antoku, just a child, was taken to sea during the Battle of Dan no Yura. When the tide turned against his family, his grandmother took him in her arms and leapt into the waves. It was suicide, sacrifice, and escape all at once. They were not alone. Dozens of noble women followed. The sea filled with silk and despair. The imperial regalia, sword, mirror, jewel, sank with them. The boy emperor vanished beneath the tide, the throne swallowed by water. His reign ended not with rebellion or illness, but with hands around his waist and the deep hush of the sea. Now to a moment closer to earth, though no less surreal. In 1911, Jack Daniel, the man behind the whiskey, died not from drink, but from infection. The infection came from a wound on his toe. The wound came from a kick, and the kick came from a safe he couldn't open. In frustration, he had lashed out with his foot. It's comical almost. A giant of liquor, a king of American indulgence, brought down not by whiskey but by steel and impatience. A stubbed toe, a slow rot, and eventually silence. The bottle lived longer than the man. And finally, for this chapter, we visit the towering mind of Ludwig Boltzmann, the Austrian physicist who gave us the statistical understanding of entropy, how all systems fall apart, how all things drift toward disorder. He knew it better than anyone. And one day, while staying at a hotel near Trieste, he hanged himself. Entropy, it seemed, had won. But later, science proved him right. The universe does drift. The patterns he saw, the numbers he calculated, they were the truth. It is a bitter and brilliant legacy, to die in despair, only to be vindicated by the very chaos that once crushed your spirit. Sometimes the universe is cruel. Other times it writes apologies in the stars. So now we pause again. With feet stubbed on safes, emperors dragged into oceans, physicists drowned in equations, and singers left bleeding on backroads. Not every death is grand. Most are strange, a few are unjust, but all of them glow just faintly in the fabric of time.